Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today, I'll be reviewing Reworld. This game was designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling, and it is an interstellar colonization game split into two parts. In the first half of the game, you will still be in orbit around Earth, and you will be using hand management in order to grab the correct colonization materials from the middle of the table, and then installing them onto your colony ship in the correct order using a new stack building mechanism. Then, in the second half of the game, you will go to light speed, arrive at the new planet, and then competitively try to build the best area of cities on the planet for yourself so that the majority of the population capsules heading over there with all the people are going to want to land where you are. First, I'll explain how the game works in more detail, and then I'll jump into my review. Here in the middle of the table, we have the Colossus Station. Now, along the outside are 20 different slots to put down these tiles, and we randomly pull them out of the bag at the beginning of every one of the rounds. So we are in a position to start the first turn of the game. Each player starts the round with a hand of cards, and the number of which is going to vary based on the player count. And the cards all have numbers from 1 to 5. And on a player's turn, all they do is take cards from their hand, they play it out onto a slot on Colossus Station, and then take the associated tile. So, for instance, we could take this 1 right here, we could place it down right there on the board, and there are no restrictions right now. We could put any of our cards down onto the spot, and now we would take this 1 tile here. When we go ahead and take a closer look at it, we see that it is the Evoc Corp. This is a brown building, and we are going to be forced to put this down onto our own settlement ship in the 1 row. You'll see we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it must be in that row because we used the 1 card in order to actually grab that tile. With that done, our turn is now over and play goes to the next player, and they are going to play a card down here and go ahead and try to grab a tile as well, but they now have a restriction. They can place onto any of the spots that are not adjacent to this one with any card they want to, but if they want to go next to this one on either side, then they must play a one of their own. So they could, for instance, take this one, put this right down here, then they would get to take this brown Evoc Corp one right here. This would go onto their 1 row, and that will finish out their turn. Play now goes on to the next player, and let's say they want to grab this tile right here, but they have no 1s in their hand. Well, instead, they could play 2 of any card onto this spot in order to get over the restriction of matching the number, and it's important because the card that is on top is going to dictate what row this tile will go into. So for instance, if they did this, then this satellite right here would go into that player's 3rd row. At this point, play goes to the next player, and for instance, they maybe put this 2 here, they go ahead and take this and put this into their 2 row, and maybe it is our turn again, but we really want to grab this tile right here. It is now between 2 different tiles, so we have a new restriction. We have to match both this 3 as well as this 2 right here. That means that the lowest number of cards we could play would be this 3 and a 2 onto the slot, either the 3 on top or the 2 on top. But let's say, for instance, we didn't have any 2s in our hand. Instead, we could go ahead and play this 3 matching this one, and then 2 of any other numbers in order to make up for matching this one, using 3 cards essentially, and then choosing whichever one to go on top to match the row. And of course, in the worst case scenario, if we had no 3s as well, then we could just use 4 of any cards to slap down onto the spot in order to take this tile right here. Now, there's another special thing with this specific tile. It's called a Terabot, and you will see that it matches this little token on the board. This is going to be the round tracker. You'll see there are 5 different slots, which means we will do 5 full rounds of filling up this board with cards and then clearing it off. But also, you'll see this little symbol right here, which is victory points. And that means that in the first round, every time anybody takes one of these Terabot tiles, they're going to take 4 points. In the second round, they will also get 4 points, but if they're in the 5th round and they grab one of these Terabots, they will only grab 2 points as a bonus. At this point, you now know all of the restrictions for placing cards down onto the Colossus Station. Of course, in a real game, people are not going to be clustered like this. They're going to be scattered all throughout the place until they start to get really restricted by the places they go to. But when it is your turn, you also have 2 other options available to you. The first is you could put any card, for instance, this 3 right here, down onto this spot on the board. You will immediately gain 1 victory point, and then you'll get to take this starting player token so that you will start off the next round of the game. I've now gone ahead and skipped forward to near the end of our first round of the game to explain the last thing you can do on your turn. You might be in a situation where you have these 3 cards in your hand and you maybe cannot actually place them down into any slot on the board, or you choose not to. Instead, you can pass, which is going to take you out of the round entirely, but then you are going to generate 1 victory point for every card that you did not play. So if I passed right now, I'd be out of the round, but I get 3 victory points. Once all players have passed, we go into some cleanup. We're going to go ahead and discard all of the tiles that were not grabbed in this one given round. all of these cards are going to get taken off of the board, and we will scoot this round marker once forward. We'll go into our big bag here, which now has 80 tiles. We'll put 20 more out, and we will shuffle up the cards, deal them out to the players, and do this 4 more times. Once the 5th and final drafting round here at the Colossus Station is complete, we'll be done with the first half of the game. Everybody's spaceship will be fully loaded up with their supplies. They will all now head out to the new solar system, and we will go into the second phase where we are going to go ahead and populate that planet. All right, so we're now in orbit around the new planet, and let's say, for instance, these are all the tiles we grabbed in the first half of the game. We would probably normally have more tiles than this, but this will be good for demonstration purposes. Now, the player who took the starting player token in the final draft round of the game is going to start off this next phase, and it's really simple. All you do on your turn in the second half of the game is you take the leftmost tile from one of your 5 rows, and you activate it by putting it over into the right-hand side of your ship, essentially signifying settling the planet. And some of these are really easy. The terabots right here, for instance, are quite simple. You can just take them, and if you'll look down here, you'll see they have their own little engine. That means that they can fly down to the planet with no problems. This is a B terabot, so it's going to fly down here, and it is going to automatically start building the town of New Boston. There are 4 of each of the different Bs in the game, so we can go ahead and put that like that. It kind of matches the train up nicely, and that's all you do with this B terabot. Likewise, we could go ahead and take this D terabot and fly it down here on a subsequent turn, and this could start off New Dallas. So now we have a couple different types of modules over here. The next important one is this right here, the shuttle. You see there's a shuttle here and a shuttle right here. You notice this one has 2 shields on the bottom, and this one has none, but I'll talk about what that means later on in this video. So now let's go ahead and activate a shuttle, and when you take them, you are going to be able to pick up to 2 of the building modules. They can either be on the row that they are grabbing from or from the ends of any of the other rows. So that means this shuttle right here could go ahead and grab this life farm, and then it could also grab this roadhouse right here, or roundhouse, sorry, because it is the leftmost in that column. It's going to kind of attach them to the side of the shuttle, and it's going to fly down to the surface. At this point, both of these modules are going to get installed into one of the cities, or different cities if you want to. And for instance, they could take this roundhouse one and put it right here into B. And what that means is, for the rest of the game, you can only put these roundhouse kind of orange with little balls symbol building down into the B area. You could put more B terabots down here, but you can't put any other colors except for white. White is a wild color. Everybody needs farms for food, so this player might end up going just like that with their turn, and then they can put their shuttle up here, and it is important to show how many of these you've used. The next time it comes back around to us, perhaps we want to do the same thing by taking this shuttle right here. We could go ahead and grab both of these buildings. We put the shuttle right there, and we now have these 2 different color modules. And we are in a bit of a bind because we only have 2 different types of cities founded. In fact, if we look at our entire area, we only have the Bs and the Ds. So we probably did not do a good job of actually drafting these tiles. But what that means is we now are going to have to choose which one of these is going to get locked into this city here. For instance, we can maybe put this brown one just like that. And since there's no actual city to put this building in, we're just going to discard it and make no use out of it. Definitely a poor way to plan it, but that's kind of how we built out our tiles. So next time it comes back around to us, we are also in another bad situation here. I've definitely not built this out to get a lot of points, but it does show how you can get yourself into trouble because, well, we have a brown one right up here, and you'll notice we have no more shuttles. We needed another shuttle in order to get this tile down, and in fact, we have this one and this one as well that have no ability to fly down to the surface because you see they have no engines. So instead, for your turn, you could simply take one of these modules and just burn it up in the atmosphere. That evaluates your entire turn. But now something interesting might have happened when we took the last tile from this second row. When we look back to the main board, you'll notice these 14 different colony capsules, and every single one of them has a different condition on them. And these are races, essentially. The first person to meet the condition on any of these is going to take it and get the victory points. So for instance, this player just got rid of everything on their 2 row, which means this little colony capsule is going to land down into their area and immediately generate for them 5 victory points. And you'll notice there's one of these for every single one of the 5 rows. There's also one for completing every single one of your rows, being the first person to use all of your tokens. And this one gives you 7 points if you're the first person to reach 70 points. When we now look up at the top 7 of these, you'll see you get points for other types of objectives. For instance, this one right here says you get 5 points if you're the first person to activate 5 of your shuttles. This one right here gives you 5 points if you founded all 5 of your cities and you have at least a shield activated, which I have not talked about just yet, and you have a variety of other things. Every single one of these 14 races are things you are going to be trying to do before one of your opponents. All right, let's now come back to our ship so I can explain the last 2 types of modules. The first looks a lot like the ones we've seen already. You'll notice this brown one right here has these little golden symbols up on the top. That means this is a special tile. There's one of these for each of the 5 main colors in the game. And if we pretend by a movie magic that I had miraculously had another one of these shuttles so that I could actually pick this one up and go ahead and land it down onto the planet, we can put it right here, and you'll notice that the little symbol points backwards, and that means that you will immediately get 1 point for every tile in that city. So by placing this, we get 1, 2, 3, 4 victory points. But of course, we are not cheaters. In this case, we didn't actually have a shuttle to do that, so we would probably just discard this in order to try and get the bonus for being the first person to complete our number 1 row. Okay, so finally we have these satellites down here. You'll notice, first of all, they have little engines, so that means they can be deployed by themselves, but the engines are tiny, and that's because they don't actually go down onto the planet. They get launched and they stay in orbit. And the moment you activate these and put them down into your area, you are going to score victory points equal to the criteria on that satellite. And every single satellite has a different criteria. For instance, this one right here will get you 1 victory point for every single terabot that you currently have out here in your area. So if I put this down just like that, I would make 2 victory points. But instead, if I waited on this until I had put this B right there, this D right here, and this B over like that, and then activated this right here, we would probably want to do that because we would instead get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 victory points for placing this satellite out. Now, you may notice that these satellites also have little shields on them, just like these shuttles, and that's because whenever you activate a shuttle or a satellite, you have an alternate option available to you. For instance, if we just burn this one up in the atmosphere because I didn't draft enough shuttles, we now could look at this one, and it's going to get us 3 points for every one of these brown modules we have, but that might not be enough points for us. Instead, we could flip this over, and it now shows this shield just like that. We can put this down here, and we've essentially scrapped the satellite and used the parts for it to help our defenses for our general area over here. And this is how you get those shields, which will help you do things like this objective that I already talked about. So at this point, play will keep going around the table until everybody has played all of their tiles, at which point we will go into the only piece of final scoring, which is this gargantuan final population ship. You see, it is going to score on 6 different criteria, and it is different for the 2 to 3 player game and the 4 player game. But in the 2 to 3 player game, you'll see that the person who has the most of these shields in front of them is going to get 15 points, second most is going to get 7, and then you will evaluate each one of the cities. The person who has the largest A city gets 14 points, 6 points for the second place person, and then all the way down to the E city. So obviously, the higher it is in the alphabet, the more lucrative it is because of the scoring structure. And then for every one of these races that a player has nothing in, they lose 3 points. So we have a terrible colony over here. We only did B and D. Perhaps we were able to win B because we have quite a few tiles here, but instead we would lose 3 points for not having an A, 3 points for not having a D, or an E, or a C. So definitely a bad way to build your colony, but that is how you get the rest of the points in the game. And at that point, you see who has the most points, and they're the winner. Let's now go ahead and start the review for Reworld, and we'll begin with a few positive points. And the first of these has to do with the hand management pool drafting mechanism as you actually grab these resources and put them down onto your ship. I think that this is just a wonderfully elegant mechanism. I love pool drafting in games in general, but the extra tweak of playing the cards down and the adjacency rules for those cards is really wonderful. Just to recap it, like if you want to put a card down that's adjacent to another card, you have to make sure they match, but if they don't match, you can put down 2 of any card in order to grab that tile anyway. And you have a couple important decisions here. First of all, what 2 cards do you pull out of your hand in order to put down onto that spot, and which card is going to go on top? Because that's not only going to dictate where that resource goes onto your ship, and I'll talk about that part in another one of these points, but it's also going to have to do with what restrictions are now in play for your opponents to take the next tile that is maybe adjacent to that 2 cards that you just put down onto the table. You might look down at your hand and see that you have like 4 ones, and so you might spend a 1 and then maybe like a 3 or something like that, put the 1 on top because you know there's only 6 ones in the entire deck, and that means you have a strong position to grab the next tile that's adjacent to it if of course you want that tile. And of course, other players might spend 2 cards in order to go there anyway, but that's fine because that means they're spending extra points to do it. This is another wonderful part of this mechanism in that every single card that you don't use, that you discard at the end of the round, you get 1 point for. So you can directly consider the price in points for every one of these tiles you're grabbing. The base cost for a tile is 1 point because 1 card is the minimum that you have to spend. But if you're spending 2 cards in order to take that, now you have to think, is this tile worth losing 2 points? And more often than not, it is. But if you have a situation where you're trying to grab a tile that is between 2 other cards, the minimum number of cards you might spend is 2, and the maximum might be 4 if you have no matching cards. And that means you're going to be spending 4 points in order to take that tile, and that may or may not be worth it to you, and that's something you really need to think about. Also, you only have so many cards in your hand. It, of course, depends on the player count, but if you're spending 4 cards in a 4-player game where you only have 7 cards total, that's incredibly expensive and just another thing that you need to think about. And I really love it. I think it's just a wonderfully elegant system where just you match a card, it's 1 card. A wild is 2, and then for 3, if you match, then you can go wild on the other one. It seems to make so much sense, and it creates a wonderful set of decisions when I'm actually figuring out how to manage this hand of cards that I got at the beginning of the round. Positive point number 2 has to do with the stack building mechanism, and this is a direct lead off from positive point number 1 because after you have played those cards down, you take the tile and then you have to put it into the row that is associated with the number on that card, and you are building a stack of these tiles. And I call it stack building because I can't really think of what else to call it. I haven't seen another game that has this mechanism, and I think it's a really neat idea because it's very puzzly. Like, the order in which you put these in is super important because in the second half of the game, you have to destruct these rows from the leftmost side down, and that means that the things that are closer to the ship are probably going to be activated later than the ones farther away from the ship, but not necessarily because you don't need to build these rows evenly. Like, you can have one row be gigantic and another row be completely empty when you go into the second phase of the game if you wanted to. That may or may not be a good idea, but you certainly are going to want to vary the lengths of these rows, and you're probably going to want to try and do some sorting. Like, you might want to put all of your satellites into one row. You might want to try to put your Terrabots into one row. You might want to always have it go building shuttle so that you can easily take that shuttle and land those buildings onto the planet. But you are not always going to have that ability. Like, if the game did not have the wonderful hand management that I talked about in positive point number 1, it'd be just very straightforward. You just put things into the right rows that you wanted to. But the fact that you're restricted by the cards you have in your hand means you might desperately want to put a shuttle down on the second row, but you have no 2 cards in your hand. Maybe you spent them all already, or you just didn't draw any. So you got to come up with a different plan. Maybe you will play that 3 down, grab the shuttle, put it into the 3 row, and now you need to, when you destruct these, consider that you will want that shuttle to be the leftmost tile, and then the buildings that you want to land also to be uncovered at that point so the shuttle can take off, grab those modules, and then land them down on the planet. So you are constantly thinking about the tempo of which, how you are going to be destructing these. Like, you are essentially building a plan that you are going to evaluate in the second half of the game. And you do have some decisions and some abilities to tweak how you actually evaluate that plan. But the framework of that plan is very much set in stone by the order in which you build these stacks. I think it's just a wonderful action selection mechanism. You are essentially building these sequential sets of actions for the second half of the game. And in the second half of the game, I guarantee you will be cursing the decisions you made in the first, but that's honestly part of the fun. For positive number 3, I'd like to discuss the theming of this game and how it integrates into the mechanics. And I think they did a very good job of this. This is not the kind of game where you could just come up with another theme easily, slap it down, and have it make sense. Like, I suppose you could have colonization of, like, the Americas, where you are loading up a sailboat and then sending it across the ocean. But even then, I feel like the stack building would make less sense because in there you are filling up a cargo hold. So you might have, like, just a mess of stuff all over the place. Whereas with a spaceship, you could kind of mentally imagine that these things are literally latching onto each other on the outside of the ship, ready to take off for the stars. Of course, there is a certain level of abstraction going on there, but you also have the pool draft where you're taking the tiles from the middle of the table and you are all competitively trying to make the best colony on the planet. So, and there's only a finite amount of resources on Earth that you can actually grab from. So it makes sense that you are competing right there. And then when you actually get to the planet and you start building out your cities, first of all, I like that you have little city signposts. So it's like new New Ankara or New Dallas or New Essen that you can build out to give you a little bit of theme and personality to the cities that you're building. But also, I like the idea that all of those scoring objectives are kind of like little colony pods full of people, and they're going to want to land in the part of the planet that they think they will survive the best at. And for some reason, they feel like the person who clears their row number 4 first is obviously better than other people. So they're going to go ahead and land down into their city. And that obviously shows that the theming connection gets a little bit strained at some of those points. Also, with the buildings that you're putting down into the area, it's like essentially an orange building or a brown building or a purple building. Why can you only have one color, one type of building in a city? That doesn't necessarily make sense, but all board games have a certain level of abstraction, and I think the thematic connections that they were able to pull into the mechanics that you're doing here worked quite well, and I enjoyed them. It's now time to move into a couple neutral points, and the first of these has to do with the construction race, essentially the second half of the game, as you are choosing one of the tiles that are on the leftmost side to land down onto the planet. You are racing after 14 different objectives, and you are not only racing after those objectives, but you're also trying to build things up so that you will score your satellites the best. And I have a couple things to say about this. The first is that, to a certain degree, this phase of the game kind of feels like it plays itself. In the first half of the game, you're building up these stacks, you're building up all of the ordering in which you can actually fly these things down, and in the second half, odds are good you're in general going to try to follow the plan that you've already made, and you will probably change things up invariably due to a couple reasons. One, you will make mistakes with how you build those things, so you'll have to make decisions in the second half to figure out how you are going to deal with the mistakes that you made. Also, you are racing after those modules, and maybe you find yourself really activating this row number 2 over and over and over again because you have a tiny advantage on one of your opponents who also keeps activating their number 2 row, but you are just ahead of them. So if you just do that whole row, then you know you're going to get that 5-point bonus, and that might be worth it to you. While you're doing that, you are stalling out on some of the other things that you're doing. But of course, you are chasing 14 different races here, and you want to win as many of these as you can, but you have to know what to kind of back off on. And there is a little bit of information overload when it comes to this, depending on the player count. In a 2-player game, you can kind of look over and you only have one person to analyze, but they are going to have tons of tiles in front of themselves. But if you are in a 3 or 4-player game, in a 4-player game in specific, you are going to have to look at a ton of stuff in order to make the right decision, specifically when you're trying to figure out where to land your white wild buildings, because you are doing some area majority as well with each one of these cities, and you might be one away from taking the 15 points on the A, for instance, and you want to look around and analyze, well, how many A's do you have? How many A's do you have? How many A's do you have? What color have you put into your A? How many of that color do you still have over there? And how many A terabots have you not played yet? And you can allow yourself to kind of fall into the analysis of this overloading amount of data, which is not amazing. And honestly, what I've ended up seeing is not a lot of analysis paralysis. I've just found that people kind of just do their own thing for the most part and don't really analyze on those area majorities as much as maybe they should. But either way, I enjoy this second half of the game, but I do feel like it, it doesn't engage me quite as much as the actual act of building these stacks up. I wish there was maybe a little bit more reason to activate one thing over another, and I think part of that has to do with the somewhat rigid rules, like you have to use a shuttle in order to grab those buildings, and things with the satellites, you're going to want to score them after you've done everything that you can to get the most scoring value for that satellite. And these are all interesting decisions, but the reason this is a neutral point is because, like I said, I do find that it's not, it doesn't necessarily work perfectly. It definitely works, but it's probably going to be a bigger issue for some people than it is for others. Neutral number 2 is less of a point and more of a question. And that is that I don't fully understand the reason for the extra terabot scoring in the first half of the game. Now, just to refresh you, this is that whenever you grab a terabot tile with the A, B, C, D, or E, and you put it onto your ship, you're going to take a number of victory points that is going to vary based on the drafting round that it is. And you get more points the earlier in the game in that you go ahead and grab these terabots. And to a certain extent, I kind of get that, because the earlier you take a terabot, the closer it is going to be to your ship, which means the later it is you're going to actually activate that terabot. And in general, terabots you're probably going to want to activate earlier in the second round because you might need them in order to found one of your cities, for instance. But at the same time, terabots are good. Like, they're always good, I feel like. When you draft them, I don't feel like there is a need for an extra incentive. Oh, when you draft this, you get a number of points. Sure, it goes down as you get closer to the end of the drafting phase, but Terrabots are going to increase the size of your city, which is great for the endgame scoring with whoever has the biggest city. Terrabots also interact with many of the satellite scorings. And then also you need Terrabots to found your cities. Like they fly themselves down to the planet, so they're one of the easiest things to activate. And there's pretty much never a time when you don't want to activate a Terrabot. So they're the most generic, almost things that you can activate in the second round of the game. There's really no reason not to activate a Terrabot when you can, unless there's something that's more pressing. And so I just don't understand why they have extra points associated with them. I feel like it's an extra tacked on mechanic that they obviously the designers felt like this was necessary. Like I've played this game 4 times and they probably played it 100 times. So they felt like Terrabots needed a little bit of an incentive, but I'm not really seeing it. And that's why this is a neutral point. I don't think it's bad. I don't think you should remove it. I just don't fully understand it. We've now reached the negative point section, and I only have one to cover, and specifically it has to do with the tiny iconography on a lot of these tiles and how it can make analysis hard. I already talked about in neutral point number 1 that if you have a whole bunch of players around the table, then you can really find yourself having way too many things to analyze. And I think that the graphical design choices that they did with this game did not do that analysis any favors. Specifically, a really important thing to analyze from your opponents is how many of the specific colored pawns that they have in their area. And well, you have an orange and you have a red and you have a yellow, and they all have different icons in the middle of them, like a little pyramid or little bubbly things, but you have to really squint and see that. Like the tiles are not that big, and then the icon on those tiles is really tiny. And I just feel like something could have been done. They could have used more space on these buildings, like make the whole building purple and have a big icon in the middle of it or something to make it pop off of the board a little bit better. And I think if they had done something like that, maybe the game would be slightly more visually appealing as well. While I do think that the thematic integration of the mechanics is pretty solid, I will also say that when you look out, it's kind of a bland sea of grayish stuff that's in front of you. And I feel like if they had gone with more color on these specific tiles and larger icons, it would make the game look better and make it a lot easier to glance across the table and figure out just what your opponent's strengths are so that you can play around them. Okay, we've now reached the variability section of the review, and my honest assessment here is that it's a little bit less than I was expecting going into the game. You have a few things going for the variability. The biggest one is that big bag of 100 module tiles that you're going to be putting down onto your ship. Well, you're going to go through that entire bag every single time you play the game, no matter what the player count is, but the order in which stuff comes out is going to make one game play different from the next. Like if you have just a ton of shuttles come out in the early game, well, you know they're not going to come out in the late game, and that's definitely going to influence the size of all the cities that you're building and the way that you're going to go ahead and build those things. But there is a conspicuous lack of initial direction that this game gives you, and maybe I'm just spoiled, but it does seem like these days many Euro-style games will give you either a hidden goal or maybe something that is public that makes you slightly different than the other opponents around the table. And things like that can give you a little bit of direction. Like when you first start a game, when you first start every game of Reworld, you look at this hand of cards and you look out to all these tiles on the table, and you're going to try to find a good combo, but you're starting with a blank slate. Like everybody has a blank slate, and I am okay with that, but I feel like it would have been great to spice things up a little bit with some hidden objectives for a little bit of extra points at the end of the game to cause you maybe to go more for that one color or for this one style of play versus another, or even go wacky and have like asymmetric player powers. Although every game does not need asymmetries, I will fully admit that. But like I said, I just wish there was a little bit of something that gave initial direction that would also make one game feel more different from the next. Reworld plays 2, 3, and 4 players, and I have played 2 and 3 player games of this. And I think that 3 is likely the best way to play this game, not having tried the 4-player experience. The biggest thing that's going to differ between the different player counts is the number of cards that you have when you are drafting in the first half of the game. In the 2-player game, you have 13 cards in your hand. In the 3-player game, you have 9. And in the 4-player game, you have 7. And there's a couple things that are going on here. First of all, with 13 cards in your hand, that's just a lot to analyze. That's a lot of stuff that you can do. And with that many cards, that means you're going to be drafting a lot more tiles onto your ship. And so when you get to that second phase of the game, you're going to have these mountainous rows of tiles in front of you versus a 4-player game, which I have not tried, but I can imagine if you only have 7 cards to draft with in the beginning, and then you have a 4th person who is vying for those tiles in the middle, you're going to have very meager rows in front of you. I think it's going to be a lot tighter, probably a little bit meaner of a game in a 4-player experience. Also because you have 3 different opponents that you're vying for the majorities on all those cities, and you have a lot less tiles to actually go for it. Like in the 2-player game that we played, we both easily had cities that were like 8 or 9 tiles large. But in a 4-player experience, I imagine that would be almost unheard of. And then you have the situation where the one that's right in between, where you have 9 cards in your hand and only 2 opponents around the table. I think that is likely the best situation for it. But I will admit that I am looking forward to trying it at 4. I like tight, cutthroat drafting style experiences. I think it will probably play great at 4, and 2 is okay. I felt like having only one opponent and just kind of this glut of resources took away a little bit of the fun from the game. So it was good at that player count, but I think 3 is best. In conclusion, I've played Reworld 4 times at this point, and I've enjoyed every single one of those plays. My expectations going into the first play were pretty much nothing. It was taught to me, I didn't know anything about the game, and I found myself constantly throughout that first play saying, oh, this is cool. Oh, that's neat. Oh, that's cool. And I went away from that first game feeling like there were some really great, fresh takes on some familiar gaming mechanisms in this package right here. And so the first thing is the pool drafting. I love pool drafting, where you are grabbing things from the middle of the table so that you have it, nobody else can take it. But the fresh layer added onto this has to do with his hand management. We have these cards, and the card that you put down is not only going to dictate where that tile goes into your ship, so that's puzzling in that way, but also that card is going to dictate restrictions on whoever is going to try and grab a tile that is adjacent to that one. So the area that you are drafting from is going to get really full, and then you have these extra good decisions of trying to figure out how many cards to spend, what card's going to be on top, because it's going to restrict other people, and it's going to dictate where you put your tiles down into your various rows. And then when you come down to your rows or your stack building area that I've talked about, this is essentially a fresh take on programming in games. In general, if you have a programming style game, that means you're probably going to be playing out 3 to 4 actions or tiles or something like that, and then you're going to evaluate them in order. But most of those games should probably be called subroutine games because it's a tiny little thing, whereas in Reworld, you really are building a full program, essentially. Like the first half of the game is you writing this program by building all of these stacks in these rows, and then you are going to evaluate, you're actually going to run that program in the second half of the game, which is a really cool experience. Also, from a programming perspective, old-timey programming languages actually use stacks in them to sort all this information. So it definitely has a much better connection to the term programming game than other ones do, but I think there's a bit of a clash of terms when it comes to that. When it comes to some of the things that I was not as crazy about, like I did enjoy the act of evaluating my program, but I did feel like there is a sea of things to analyze from your opponents, and it's kind of hard to see what they have because of the tiny icons out on all of their overlays, and just you try to find these little bits of color and icons in this sea of gray bits that are in front of them. I do feel like the iconography and the graphic design of the game could have lent itself a little bit better to figuring out how to analyze this stuff. And also, I do think that starting every single game with the same exact clean slate is fine, but I do wish there was a little bit more variability here with perhaps hidden objectives or something like that to make one game start off with a different strategic trajectory from the next, as opposed to just like saying, okay, well, this game, maybe I'm going to go heavy Terrabots or something like that. But at the end of the day, I think that this is a really good game. All of these mechanics really seem to button themselves up quite well. I think there's a lot of elegant, great ideas here. And if this sounds interesting to you, I heartily recommend you give it a shot because we've had a lot of fun playing it. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting this channel through Patreon, including all of these producer-level pledges. If you too would like to directly support the channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and monthly vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.